Okay, so good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for the 12th and final session in SCAG's Traffic Safety Peer Exchange. My name is Courtney Aguirre, and I'm a program manager for public health and safety at SCAG. My pronouns are she, her, hers. Hopefully you've seen that or glimpsed it in the chat if you're able. I'll be facilitating today's session along with John Overman, one of our consultant supports on this project. If you haven't introduced yourselves in the chat, please feel free to do so that we get a sense of who our audience is, who's in the room, since we want to hear from you today and we want to talk to you throughout the session. If you could advance one slide for us, Edward. There we go. So this peer exchange is anticipated to run for about an hour and a half. Right now, all participant lines should be muted, and at the end of each presentation, we're going to do a brief Q&A, and then we'll do a larger Q&A with all of the panelists at the end of the 3 presentations. If you do have questions, we encourage you to type them into the chat box or to raise your hand. We'll save the questions for the appropriate Q&A, and I'll be calling on you to unmute yourself if you'd like to do things that way as well, and that's more than welcome. I don't think the session's going to be so huge. They're not meant to be, and so you should have an opportunity to use your voice if you'd like to. And I want to add, because we always get this question, all presentations are going to be emailed to those who registered to participate in today's meeting. We'll be sending out that thank you email after the session, along with hyperlinks to those the PDFs of the presentations, and we'll also be uploading a recording of the session. If you could advance one more slide, Edward. There we go. So as staff at SCAG, I acknowledge we're on the land of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh. And as we acknowledge we're on the original lands of the Chumash, the Tongva, and the Kizh peoples, and how deeply the field of urban planning continues to engage with land, we wanted to offer this acknowledgement as a first step to hopefully more conversations and actions that will support our Indigenous communities in thriving. Next slide, please. There we go. So today's peer exchange will include presentations focused on traffic safety in urban areas, specifically focusing on communities in Los Angeles County. Today, we're going to hear about traffic safety issues that, again, are facing these urban communities and how we can plan for more vulnerable populations, including pedestrians as well as bicyclists. Our speakers include 2 individuals from the city of Long Beach, a city that I love dearly as a former city staffer. We also have the director of the Safe Routes to School program for the Los Angeles Department of Transportation. And we have a very significant member of LA Metro's Office of Equity and Race. So as I mentioned, we're going to have a wrap up at the end with a panelist Q&A and a facilitated group discussion. We do want to hear from you, so feel free to use that chat feature or to raise your hand. We hope to make this interactive for you. And so next slide, please. There we go. So to start things off, I'd like to share a very brief update on our region's existing conditions to provide some context for why we're holding the traffic safety peer exchanges. I also want to highlight for some of you folks, our Go Human Education and Encouragement campaign and our resources that are available to you right now as you work to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries in your communities. Next slide. So as many of you are aware, our region is vast. It is huge. It has about 19 million people in it, half the state's entire population. We have a lot of licensed drivers, about 13 million. And each year we have about 1,500 people who are dying, 5,500 people who are seriously injured, and 124,000 people who are sustaining injuries in traffic collisions in our region. So a lot of people are being harmed on our streets every day. And we anticipate as we emerge from this pandemic, if there's ever an end in sight, that some of these rates of fatalities and serious injuries may continue to rise, particularly if people are going to shift away from using public transit or even shared vehicles. We know that these collisions are occurring in every community in our region, including the city of Long Beach, the city of Los Angeles, city of Thousand Oaks, El Centro, and Imperial. all over the county. All over the county, we're having these issues. But we do know that the vast majority, about 70% of our fatal and serious injury collisions are happening in our urban areas. And that's why the discussion today is so important, because these areas are more negatively impacted by these collisions, these more serious collisions. And we know also that about 70% of these collisions, these more serious collisions, are happening on our local roads. If you want to advance one more slide. There we go. So we have a lot of information that we have gathered that hopefully will be useful to you. Really detailed analysis on our existing conditions across the region. And we have a lot of county level data as well, a chapter for each county within this report that we just released in June. So you can take a look at it if you like. I think John's going to be throwing some links in the chat to the report for you, as well as the Los Angeles County fact sheet for you. Just so that you can get a handle on, if you don't already have a handle on, I assume many of you are familiar with your conditions, but if you'd like to get a regional look or a county level look, we have the resource for you. So in our efforts to eliminate serious injuries and fatalities across the region, SCAG engages in really a variety of efforts, including these peer exchanges and our Go Human campaign. Next slide, please. So the Go Human campaign launched in 2015 to reduce traffic collisions and encourage more people to walk and bike. But since then, Go Human activities have expanded quite a bit, and they have expanded the conversation beyond vehicular violence into a whole suite of programs that mainly fall into three categories highlighted on the slide before you. The first is that co-branded safety messaging materials. Hopefully you've seen in your communities. If you have not, please reach out to us through our website or by emailing us to request them. They're available at no cost to you. They come in the form of lawn signs, banners, bus shelter ads. A variety of different materials are available to you. We also have a kit of parts that we can share with you at no cost. The kit's a set of modular pieces that can be assembled to demonstrate different street design treatments like parklets, spillbouts, and crosswalks. That's especially helpful if you're trying to introduce a new treatment to an area of your community where folks have not yet experienced it or want to see what it could look like in advance of a permanent installation. And then we also offer safety workshops, webinars, and technical assistance grants. A different variety of grants are available to you to develop safety plans or a sustainable communities program. We also have Community Streets mini grants. It's a funding program that's meant to build street level community resilience and increase the safety of people most harmed by collisions. We also have a new community ambassadors program. So we have a lot going on, and we hope that you'll take the time to try to, learn more about the resources that are available to you right now, again, at no cost by visiting our website. And I think, again, that's something, I know it's something that we've dropped in the chat, a link to Go Human if you haven't taken advantage of these free resources that are there to help you as you do this work of trying to eliminate fatalities and serious injuries. Next slide, please. So before we really kick things off, we do have a quick Zoom poll for you that Edward, our audiovisual support, is going to be sharing with you. Two basic questions for you so that we can get a sense of who's participating in the session today. So the first question is, do you live or work in Los Angeles County? I assume most of you were probably drawn to the session because you do, but perhaps not. I know it's always very, very interesting for us to learn about how other counties are tackling issues, because there are, very similar communities, suburban communities, urban communities in different places that could relate to one another. Second question, very, very top of mind, especially for many of us as we've kicked off our equity work this past year. I know many have kicked it off or have been doing the work for years. So has equity been a consideration in your planning work? Okay, and actually I'm seeing very positive results. I'm relieved to see most of you have responded already. Most of you are in LA County, which is great. So this material, again, that we're going to share with you today will be really relevant. For those of you who aren't from or in LA County, I think it'll still be meaningful for you, and hopefully you can ask some questions. And then in terms of equity, deep relief to hear that equity is something that's being considered in your planning work right now. So thank you. Thank you for responding to those initial questions that we have for you today. And so with that, there we go. So now I'd like to welcome two folks from the city of Long Beach who are going to be speaking about their experience with their Safe Streets plan, their Safe Streets projects, and how they have integrated equity into their different approaches. So I'd like to welcome Rachel Junkin and Carl Hickman from the city of Long Beach. Rachel is a transportation planner with the City of Long Beach's Transportation Mobility Bureau. Since joining the city in 2016, Rachel has worked on active transportation programs, micro-mobility policy, the Long Beach Safe Streets Vision Zero Action Plan, and Long Beach's COVID-19 Open Streets program. Rachel has a master's degree in urban planning from USC, Fight On, Trojans. I know there's deep loyalty to that across the region. And a bachelor's degree in politics from NYU, from the New York University. And Carl Hickman is the traffic engineer and acting city engineer for the city of Long Beach, where he oversees high profile infrastructure projects and maintains a safe and efficient system of roadways. Prior to joining the city of Long Beach, Carl worked at public agencies in the San Diego area, so not too far away from us right now. He received his bachelor's in civil engineering from San Diego State. So I'd like to welcome them both. And I think Edward is going to be sharing your slides for you. So thank you both for sharing your experiences today.
Thank you, Courtney. Pleasure to be here with everybody. And once again, my name is Carl Hickman, and with me is Rachel Junkin. She'll be taking over about the midway point during our presentation. So we'll go ahead and jump right into it. Next slide, please. A little bit of background about our Vision Zero plan. Safe Streets Long Beach is the city's Vision Zero initiative. In 2016, Long Beach City Council approved a Vision Zero policy. The goal was to eliminate traffic fatalities and serious injuries among all road users by the year 2026. So the Safe Streets Action Plan was adopted in July of 2020. What we found was that traffic fatalities and serious injuries are increasing each year and claimed more lives in Long Beach than homicides in 2020. You can see the chart on the right where we are showing all the traffic collisions in the city of Long Beach. And by mode, you can see 6% of those total collisions were bicycle related, 6% were pedestrian related, and then 2% are motorcycle related. And again, the total amount of collisions, there were 86% that actually involved just motor vehicles. If you look at the chart on the right, you can see additional information there where you can see exactly what type by mode we have the fatal and serious injury collisions. So 12% of the total injuries or fatalities, again, bicyclists, pedestrians were 34% and 19% were motorcycle related. Again, we really wanted to focus our attention on the bicycle, pedestrian, and motorcycle related collisions. Next slide, please. So the next slide, we can see that we have 4 times more miles of local streets than minor arterials. However, on those minor arterials, we have 40% more serious traffic collisions than on local streets. Speeding was the most frequent motor vehicle violation in most collisions. As many of us probably know, with the current environment that we're in with COVID, the traffic volumes have gone down in general that are on the streets, but the incidence of speeding is going up, so it continues to be a problem. This year in 2021, we did a comprehensive look at our engineering and traffic surveys to try to identify roadways where we can justifiably and legally, per the vehicle code, reduce our speed limits. So we did a review of over 300 engineering and traffic surveys. And as a matter of fact, next week, we're going to council to actually reduce speed limits on approximately 50 roadway segments in the city. Now, if you look at the chart on the right, you can see where we have the vehicle miles, the miles of roadway on the right in the gray bars there. And then you can see the number of collisions on the left broken down per type of collision, whether it was a vehicle collision, motorcyclist, bicyclist, pedestrian. So based on that chart there, again, you can see that we have a large quantity of collisions that are occurring on the minor arterial roadways, even though those roadways are about 4 times less than the total local roads in the city. Next slide, please. So putting together the Vision Zero plan, or what we refer to as the Safe Streets plan, we wanted to make sure we identified clear goals, clear keystone actions that we thought would help us to achieve our goals. We want to make sure that we dedicate resources to the Safe Streets Long Beach effort. You know, a lot of what we want to do can only be accomplished if we have the funding necessary to make those steps. Again, because speeding is such an issue, we want to make sure we address the speeding problem. This includes, again, I mentioned the reduction in speed limits where possible. We've also opened up additional lines of communication with PD to make sure that we relay information to them where we need to have them increase their presence or enforcement. Item number 3, the keystone action, is we wanted to build best practice street design. Basically, we wanted to make sure that whenever we had an engineering project moving forward through the process, we wanted to make sure we were incorporating new ideas, complete streets ideas, things to make the streets and the roadways safer. You know, we can talk about all sorts of complete streets elements. We can talk about different types of striping, bikeway designs, and things like that. So we wanted to make sure that anything moving forward, we incorporated new ideas to make the streets safer for all users. Keystone action number 4, we wanted to make sure that we had more safety education for the residents about walking and biking. We wanted to make sure we collect better data to make better decisions. We use a crossroads collision database, and we were looking at ways to better provide the inputs into the system, and also better ways of using the data, collecting it, and you know, how we're going to go through the data and filter it out to make sure that we can get the data that we need. We wanted to make sure that we prioritize road safety investments through an equity lens. I'll talk more about that in a little bit. And of course, we want to make sure that we partner with local, regional, and state stakeholders to support safe streets efforts. As most of us know, you know, you have to partner with outside stakeholders, whether it's Caltrans, Metro, SCAG, whatever it may be, for the funding efforts to make your projects happen. So we wanted to make sure that we were coordinating with anybody that we had to. Okay, next slide. Now, talking about equity, we wanted to make sure that when we have new projects coming through the pipeline, we want to make sure that we're, again, adding those complete streets elements wherever we can. And one of the things that we wanted to do was develop sort of like a heat map of where a lot of the collisions were occurring. So here is a map on the left. It shows all the major roadways in the city of Long Beach. And then depending on the coded, the color codes that you see there, whether it's red, orange, etc., you can see where the high volume of pedestrian and bicycle collisions are occurring. You can see the roadways where there are motor vehicle and motorcycle collisions. And then there are also segments with sort of the dashes there that show all modes and types of collisions. The shaded area, primarily on the left, is the area in town that is really most underserved. You know, those are the areas that we call the disadvantaged areas. And we wanted to make sure that all of our projects that we were doing in those areas in the upcoming cycle of projects, we wanted to make sure that we had complete streets efforts in place to design successful projects, safer projects in those areas. So again, we had the five-year collision history analysis. It was from 2013 to 2017. We found that there was a high concentration of high injury corridors in central and downtown Long Beach. It kind of makes sense where your traffic is a little more dense. we found that the most serious collisions were happening on the minor or principal arterials, namely Anaheim, PCH, Long Beach Boulevard. 73% of the high injury corridors and 83% of the intersections are in disadvantaged communities. So again, moving forward, we wanted to make sure that we improved the complete streets elements in those disadvantaged communities. Next slide. So moving forward, as we were developing our projects, we have a variety of projects that are currently in the queue, and we are calling these our Vision Zero projects. We have some ATP Cycle 5 projects that were recently awarded. Two of them are the downtown walkable corners and the Pacific Avenue cycle track. And the renderings on the right, you can see on the far right, that is what the current Pacific Avenue intersections look like on the bottom right corner. And then you can see what is being proposed to basically improve passage for cyclists and make it safer for pedestrians as well. The two pictures on the left, that is going to be part of the downtown walkable corners project. On the bottom left there, you see what an intersection would look like currently. And then up in the top left corner, that's what we are proposing to do, to basically add sort of the bulb out on each corner, decrease the crossing distance, make it very pedestrian friendly. And we're looking to do that in the downtown walkable project at about 50 intersections in mostly the downtown area. And then we have some upcoming projects also, the Metro MAT program. We're doing a decoupling of 6th and 7th Street, putting in a bike track on 6th Street. Also, we've got upcoming Metro call for projects that are being designed and installed right now. Artesia Great Boulevard is about a $25 million project from the western city limit at Harbor all the way to the eastern city limit at Downey. So the entire stretch of Artesia is going to be improved, and many of the complete streets elements are going to be added to that project. Again, about 3.5 miles long. And then we have a HSIP project, Highway Safety Improvement Program project on Anaheim, that again is going to be adding a variety of complete streets elements, bus shelter improvements, bike lane improvements, signal improvements, and that's going to go from the LA River all the way to Terminal. So again, quite a long project. And with all of these types of projects, once the infrastructure is completed, curbs redesigned, medians redesigned, we're going to make sure that we go back afterwards and completely repave the entire extent of the project. So at the end of the day, the project is clean, striping looks nice, everything really pops and sends a good message to the users of the roadway. Next slide. Okay, this is where Rachel will take over. Go ahead, Rachel.
Thanks, Carl. So I wanted to go over some of the outreach and engagement efforts for our Safe Streets plan. So we did about 9 event pop-ups, so kind of meeting people where they are, which we think is an important part of equitable engagement. So we were at farmers markets, festivals. We did some listening sessions as well. We did one with the residents of Carmelitos Housing in North Long Beach, as well as LB Unified to get more info about youth and walking and biking to school. And then I wanted to highlight this listening bench. You can see in the photo on the left there, residents were encouraged at these events to sit down and actually record their stories. There's a microphone there, and then we used some of those stories and quotes throughout the plan to really bring a personal element to traffic safety issues. Next slide. Similarly, we had a technical advisory committee that shaped the recommendations of the plan. Lots of city departments were at the table, and obviously our partners Carl touched on, as well as our advocacy groups. So our biking and walking local advocates, as well as the Great Panthers, they advocate for older adults. So it was really nice to have them in the same room, especially with our PD and fire folks, to get them talking about traffic safety. Next slide. I also wanted to highlight some of the work that we do. This is kind of ongoing education and encouragement work. both through the Public Works Department as well as our colleagues in the Health Department. So again, meeting people where they are is very important. So we do a lot of helmet giveaways, bike light giveaways. We work with the Health Department on Bike to School Day and Walk to School Week. And we typically focus all of these events in communities of concern. We also recently rolled out a free yard sign program under the Safe Streets Initiative. We just got these Spanish yard signs last week. So we're gonna roll those out this month. So I'm really excited about that. Next slide. I wanted to highlight the U plan. This is a effort that's wrapping up. Our colleagues in the Planning Bureau and Development Services led this effort. And I think it really speaks to where we're going as far as equitable engagement. So this project was focused in North Long Beach, in an area where about 30% of residents are immigrants and 92% of residents are people of color. So the planners dedicated about 60% of the whole plan budget to engagement, and CBOs led the outreach. Long Beach Forward and Healthy Active Streets, which was great. I think is definitely best practice is having CBOs in the room. There were events where city staff weren't present to get more candid feedback. And there were, it was really about capacity building. So neighborhood empowerment workshops. There were some paid internship opportunities for high school students in North Long Beach as well. And not only did they learn about transportation planning, they learned about planning as a career, which I think is amazing too. So this plan should be out soon. Hopefully we can, us in Public Works can get some funding to implement some of the recommendations that came out of this. Next slide. And I just wanted to wrap it up by highlighting some of the broader citywide equity initiatives that the city is working on. So I wanted to highlight these four. The kind of oldest and more standardized policy we have in the city is our language access policy. So 47% of residents speak a language other than English at home. So this policy dedicates resources for staffing translations for community meetings, doing interpretation for the 4 languages most frequently spoken at home. So English, Spanish, Khmer, and Tagalog. Then we have the Equity Toolkit, which came out a couple of years ago. This is a great document. It helps both staff and residents. It's both internal facing and external. And it helps folks better understand how they can incorporate equity into not only like scoping their projects, but how they go about customer service or engagement. So it's really a great introductory document. Then we have the framework for racial reconciliation. This came out last year. This was very quickly drafted and approved after the murder of George Floyd and the protests both globally and here in Long Beach. So with that came recommendations for an internal transformation work group. So each department in the city assigned racial equity champions to help create a department-specific racial equity plan. So we're just starting that, as well as mandatory staff training for the department. So that effort is kind of just starting now this year. And I also wanted to highlight the digital inclusion work. I think this past year and a half has really highlighted the discrepancies in access that folks have to high quality internet. So the digital inclusion roadmap just came out this year, but this work has been ongoing for quite some time. So if that's something of interest, I highly recommend checking out that document as well. So I think that's it for me. Next slide. Yeah, thank you. I think we ran a little long, but appreciate it.
Thank you, Rachel. Thank you, Carl. I think well worth the long longer time, right? Runtime. I tried to include links in the chat to documents you were referencing or work you were referencing. If I overlooked anything critical you'd like to highlight for folks, feel free. I do have, we like to ask one question at least. Folks, I hope you will be putting questions in the chat for Rachel and Carl. We can come back to them in the larger group discussion. But for now, we do have a question. I mean, it sounds as though you have been successful in partnering with CBOs through your planning work. And I wondered if you had any recommendations for folks who've not yet done that type of, partnering, or if you have any recommendations on what makes it successful. I was really interested to hear that you have hosted or you plan hosted sessions without city staff, which I think is very meaningful. So I know we don't have but a minute, but I wonder if you care to touch on anything that I've asked.
Yeah, again, that wasn't my project, but I was on the TAC. I also think it's very impressive. I know in our census outreach, we contracted directly with CBOs. In the U-Plan work, CBOs were essentially a sub to the typical consultant prime. So I think that's a little bit easier as far as from a bureaucracy standpoint to get your CBOs paid, and doing outreach is just have them as a sub. But I know there are ways to go about directly contracting with CBOs. So yeah, I am excited to learn more about that too. I think, I think we're all kind of going in that direction. I do think that having staff not present at meetings can really help build trust in a way too, and get that more candid dialogue. So yeah, I think it's a great kind of best practice for sure.
Yeah, that's really fascinating. And I hope we can talk about that a bit more, in the facilitated discussion about, again, the partnerships with CBOs and how you can make that happen in these big bureaucracies or for governmental agencies. I know what it's like, and it's a challenge. But we do want to, keep to time, of course. And I would like to welcome our next presenter, our next speaker, Margot Rogers Oconus. I'd like to welcome you to share the stage. I want to introduce you first, of course, but as the City of Los Angeles' first pedestrian coordinator, Margot led the development of the city's first public placemaking program, the Vision Zero High Injury Network, and founded the city's Safe Routes to School program. And as director, she has secured over $70 million to fund design and construction of school neighborhood street improvements, installed and hosted the city's first tactical urbanism demonstration events, conducts comprehensive active transportation safety education and skills training, including annual citywide walk to school days that engage over 60,000 students. And one of the nation's largest Safe Routes to School programs, Margot collaborates closely with the Los Angeles Unified School District, the nation's second largest school district, along with coordinating with multiple city and regional agencies and community-based organizations. That is quite a tall order of business for you, Margot. Welcome, and I think, Edward, there you go. Feel free to start when you're ready.
Thank you, Courtney. I will be honest that my internet seems to be unstable. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but something that might help is if you stop sharing your visual, that can help with bandwidth.
Okay.
That's what, yeah.
Okay, sounds good. I'll just look for a thumbs up or thumbs down if this is not going well. Okay, great. Well, I'm gonna jump right in. Again, thank you for that warm welcome. It's actually great to follow Long Beach in the sense that they did a great job of outlining many of the tactics that we use in the city of Los Angeles. So it really provided a great foundation for me to shift in my presentation to a focus on the Safe Routes to School and its role in traffic city in a very complex city such as Los Angeles. Safe Routes to School really has been a core initiative of a couple key citywide initiatives, including Vision Zero, our mobility plan, because Safe Routes to School plans build out networks within neighborhoods where many of our schools are located. We're also a key component of the Green New Deal, and also just recently an Executive Directive 25, which is the mayor's wish to see more active transportation corridors. So next slide, please. And the reason Safe Routes to School, again, is really helpful in addressing that traffic safety issue across the city is because of just the really unfortunate numbers when it comes to crashes and the youth population. Traffic crashes are the leading cause of death for children ages 5 to 14 in the city. A high percentage of these are happening within the quarter mile of a school zone. And not surprisingly, during pickup and drop-off time, when this highest volume of very vulnerable users are in the public space. Next slide, please. So I did give a little bit of think as I was pulling this together of how to sort of think about those dilemmas that are fairly specific to the urban context. So again, so much of what Long Beach is doing, it's impressive work, and in many ways we are modeling that here in the city of LA, but perhaps to sort of put a fine point on some of the issues in a very complex city like Los Angeles, we have situations, what I'll call constituent complexity. So we're a highly densely populated city. So we've got school constituents, residents, we've got elected officials, but we've got an overlay of a lot of different elected officials, community-based organizations. So it's really important that in such a large city where our resources are incredibly finite, including our staff capacity and our funding capacity, that we're making really smart decisions, including ones that have a well-integrated social equity component, that we're really targeting our efforts to the areas of most need. So I was going to spend a bit of time and just talk about the prioritization methodologies that we developed for the schools. Vision Zero is sort of something that Safe Routes to School prioritization helped lead the groundwork for, and then ultimately our crossing guard deployment. The second kind of urban dilemma is we've got some really we need to get change effectuated in the streets in the near term, but the mechanisms that we're using, which may not be specifically restricted to urbans, is that they're just long term. So we've got a lot of bureaucracy, we've got a lot of departments involved in the public space, and we're using federal monies, which all make it very slow. So I want to focus on sort of the 3 Ps of bringing those affected changes more quickly to the communities. And thirdly, there's, from a Safe Routes to School perspective and in general, it's not just the infrastructure that needs to change to make those routes and travels safe, but also there's a whole personal component, but I'll just touch briefly on that. So next slide, please. Specifically for the Safe Routes to School prioritization, Safe Routes to School was launched in 2014, and it was so critical at that point that we have a really transparent, equity-based roadmap for, again, focusing our super limited resources. Safe Routes to School is nearly an $80 million funded program, and it is funded by 1 full-time person. So it was very important that we find a way to, again, focus into the areas of most needs. So we looked at crashes, we looked at the density of students within a school zone, if in fact they had received funding before, and as a social equity proxy, what that free and reduced price meal enrollment was. Again, this was incredibly helpful of helping to shift the paradigm across our elected office to understand that no, it's not giving a Safe Routes to School project to every council member, but citywide, really where do we need to direct those resources? So whether it's talking to parents or school leaderships, LAUSD superintendent or electeds, again, a transparent blueprint of those 835 schools ranked ordered by most need, and in the past 30 months have been focusing on those top 50. Next slide, please. I'm also very cognizant of the fact, as I'm sure all of us on this call are, is that our world is changing. And so prioritizations, like everything else, need to remain dynamic. And so while we haven't formalized it at this moment, there's very active conversation about how our prioritization should incorporate methodology indicators of climate resilience and even COVID impacts. So I've developed a relationship with the USC Earth Sciences Department and digging deeper into some of the vegetation mapping and understanding where we might want to focus our resources for cooling and what infrastructure, the role that infrastructure could play in that. And similarly, obviously not surprising with the pandemic, where are the arenas that have been hardest hit? And are we in fact thinking about our street design in a way that best accommodates those areas that have been hardest hit and perhaps need social distancing or use for more physical activity? Again, things that probably ring very true to most people on this call. So next slide, please. Just calling out that Safe Routes to School, again, with its school prioritization in 2014, was a really great groundwork for the work that I then shifted into in creating the high injury network. Obviously, the high injury network focuses primarily on arterials and boulevards, but there is no escape from them when you are working with a school zone. So again, for the purposes of directing our work, it's great to have a layover of those data-driven networks, whether it's the high injury network or the neighborhood enhanced network, and the schools. Those combined ensure that we are really tackling those areas where we see the highest numbers of crashes. The blue dots on the map do represent where those top 50 schools are. All of them are either on the high injury network or within a quarter mile. So it's really imperative that Safe Routes to School works very closely with our Vision Zero team as they focus their treatments on the arterials, and we ensure that we're dovetailing our treatments from the neighborhood network, and to get across those arterials that we're doing that all in sync. Next slide, please. Now, this one may be a bit out of the realm of infrastructure, but I just thought it'd be interesting to share that while I don't oversee the crossing guard program, I am sort of the poster child, I suppose, because I work so closely with the school communities, and crossing guards are a high priority. I simply wanted to reflect that the lessons that we've learned in developing these data-driven prioritizations have really been fundamental in thinking our shifting, both with our conversations with our engineers, with our electeds, with our constituents. And so wanted to apply that same sort of transparency to how we think about the crossing guard program, which previously had, it's a request-based program, but those who are sort of more knowing of the elected process tended to get more of those crossing guard staff assigned to their areas. It was important for us to sort of flip the model and say, but where are the areas of highest potential for risk or highest exposure of risk? So next slide, please. Apologies for the dog. We developed a prioritization such that we took our database of over 500 requested locations and looked at the following elements. We looked at the control element, which is it's an uncontrolled, it's signalized, or an always stop. And then those elements below each of those control mechanisms, whether it's road width, number of lanes, speed, et cetera, through all of those indicators into our algorithm, and again, have ranked ordered those 500 plus locations, and then applied our quite limited guard staff capacity, which is about 200, to those 500 locations. And obviously we're working on doing more recruiting, but just wanted to share that there's been such value in the learning of prioritization. So it ensures it keeps us honest and keeps the conversation, in essence, non-emotional when we're making decisions about projects. Next slide, please. The other element, as I mentioned before, is that we're all hungry for near-term improvements, but we're working with what I consider long-term mechanisms. So not surprisingly, we've shifted to activating pop-ups, doing phase 1 treatments and pilots to get people comfortable with concepts before we ask for permanent program installation. So here are a couple examples of pop-ups. This is Little Street. We took a 2-way street, converted it to a 1-way street, and significantly enhanced the area for pedestrian access, considering that close to 80% of the school actually walks to and from school. This, next slide, please. What we were pleased about this pop-up project, and as Long Beach mentioned before, it's really tough to do outreach, and pop-ups really serve that great opportunity to ensure people have to walk through it, they have to experience it. And so being able to capture the input from the communities, whether it's school community or otherwise, again, they have to interact with it, and we are thus able to get their feedback. The response was quite positive to this pop-up, and quite honestly, the next day after the pop-up, we were pulled into the council office and they dedicated $1 million to building it out. So we did go from concept to pop-up to build out of this from 2019, and then construction finished in February of 2021. So again, pop-ups have really served a very valuable engineering laboratory for us. And as I mentioned before, as an outreach tool. So some of the treatments being this median, we also put in an RRFB and a traffic signal. Next slide, please. We also did a pop-up at Westmoreland and 11th. This is one block west of a school. And in essence, we bagged a traffic signal. So this is a signalized intersection, but we bagged the signal and trialed a roundabout and actually hosted this event on Walk to School Day. So we had about 300 to 400 people moving through this roundabout, which again was this great engineering laboratory. We did haul out about 30 of our engineers and lots of note taking, but a great way to test a very innovative approach. Bagging signals is not something that we do daily. So served a great purpose in helping to shift some of the culture and thinking around that. And then lastly, next slide. We have another pop-up that is scheduled actually for this fall. Again, that green stripe is where we'll be converting a two-way to a one-way, and then the pink elbow on the map is actually where we'll be doing a school street, and I'll touch on that later, but that's actually an area that will become a pedestrian only zone for the morning drop-off and afternoon pickup. So next slide, please. Phase 1 treatments, again, some of these may look familiar to you, but just something in our toolbox so that we can bring safety treatments quickly and efficiently to our constituents. So on the top at 11th and Eldon, we actually didn't have the monies to pay for a median, but we were suffering with U-turns, et cetera, and crazy traffic on this block, which fronts the school. So we basically just built in a median using temporary materials. And then similarly on the lower portion of the slide, doing some innovative, bringing our bicycle lane all the way to the intersection, which hadn't happened before, and some additional signage and temporary curb extensions, all in the spirit of trying to calm the traffic. Next slide, please. And phase 1 treatments will also be applied to an ATP quick build project that we were awarded in this past year. We're again using temporary materials to build out curb extensions, doing some intersection murals, really to spotlight for drivers, hey, this beautiful artwork is suggesting you are now in a school zone, please drive slowly. And again, some creative center line treatments to improve the what I'll call driver compliance of parents in and around the school entrance. Next slide, please. And then to pilots. So again, we all want to implement wonderful programs, but that can be a long and arduous process. So pilots are a way to initiate that. In specific, we will be launching a school street pilot. Again, we were the recipient of a NACDO Bloomberg Philanthropies grant in this past year, and that will fund the school streets at 2 locations, really with the goal of testing it, tweaking our materials, serving the community so that it can form a citywide program. This chunk of street, again, in the caramel color, will be closed to traffic for 1 hour in the morning and the afternoon, and will be activated with play and games, et cetera. But most importantly, it reduces the school front congestion and shifts it to the street to the west, where we are structuring morning and AM vehicle valet service. And also we will be threading our USC air quality monitors into these projects to really track and provide evidence-based that by removing vehicles from that space, we're addressing not only air quality, but also the air that our youth breathe. And then next slide, please. The other pilot, which again is not so infrastructure oriented, but in the spirit of building capacity and building capacity in a program that really does help safety in school zones, is the launch of the Student Safety Patrol Program. You may be familiar with the valet service that really does help to organize traffic in the morning. And the objective, though, or in the past, these programs have been funded, I would say not funded, but actually have been implemented on the shoulders of adult volunteers. I was one of them myself, but we all know that our lives change and that continuing to be a volunteer is challenging. So we have really shifted to look at the opportunity to cultivate a set of safety leaders. This is a leadership program within elementary schools where we give them sufficient training, and they are also the leads on activities within the school campus, such as organizing walk to school day, but most importantly, they are the ones that are staffing the safety valet. So the hope is that by having our young leaders on the sidewalk, that will also inform more appropriate behavior by our drivers. So they'll be greeting the students, ensuring the safety valet, and then accompanying programs with the student body. Next page, please. And then just lastly, I touch on, as I mentioned before, in such a complex urban environment, when we engage our communities and our walking safety assessments about safe routes to school, it is beyond just infrastructure that challenges their travel to school. And so it's been a really interesting time over the past year and a half with the homeless issue and encampments, et cetera, that just calling out that, again, one of the complexities of working in an urban space is making sure that we're bringing all the appropriate partners to the table, and how critical those partnerships are for solving problems that impact our work, but for which we don't have the ownership. So working closely with the elected officials, both on the district side and the city side, our mayor's office, CBOs, and our other city agencies. So I'm sorry if I spoke quickly. I wanted to ensure that everyone got proper time to present, but happy to take a question or two as relevant.
Thank you, Margot. You covered a lot of ground. I do see one question in the chat for you right now. Perhaps you're familiar with what the radius is around a school that students live that get school bus service.
In the city of Los Angeles, for public schools, and I cannot speak to private schools, but for the public schools, sorry, I'm not able to start my video. For public schools, if you're an elementary school student, if you live beyond 3 miles of the school, you are eligible for busing. For middle and high school, you must live further away than 5 miles from the school.
And John, I think a question came in for you to ask.
Yeah, I have a bunch of questions for you, Margot, and I'll save those to the end. But I guess just a question on the prioritization, and how often do you plan to revisit that methodology? And I'm really curious about that, bringing in climate resiliency. And are you able to share kind of that prioritization process once it's completed? And how often would you recommend other cities or programs update their methodology to make sure it's dynamic?
Certainly. The first, as I shared, the first baseline prioritization for the schools was 2014. Subsequently, we refreshed it in 2018 because our crash data, we generally look at a 5-year term of the crash data. So we want to make sure that's staying fresh. And I think, like all of us, this past year and a half has really blown open the doors on a lot of different thinking about safety and equity, et cetera. So the conversations have started, and I'll be proposing that these sort of climate resilience and potentially COVID data points be included in the algorithm. And I would anticipate that we would refresh that prioritization perhaps in 2 years again. So we kind of work in 4-year blocks.
Thank you, Margot. It's always fascinating to hear about the prioritization methodologies nowadays, especially since they're, really taking into account equity indicators, equity factors. So thank you, Margot, for a really fascinating presentation. And again, we'll have a facilitated larger panel discussion in just a bit. So if you have additional questions for folks, feel free to pop them in the chat, and we'll definitely be copying and pasting them and sharing them out in just a bit. But now I'd like to introduce our next presenter. We'd like to welcome Caro Vera from LA Metro. Caro takes much of her inspiration for creating safer streets from her community's experiences biking, walking, rolling, driving, and riding public transit in South Central Los Angeles. Caro is a principal transportation planner at LA Metro's Office of Equity and Race, where she works on the Cbo Partnering Strategy, policy development, and equitable community engagement, pushing forward strategies that uplift and center historically vulnerable and marginalized communities. Welcome, Caro.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. As she mentioned, I am Caro Vera. Today, I will be talking about infusing equity into street safety in LA. Sounds pretty broad, but I'm hoping we'll get specific towards the end. Next slide. On today's agenda, I'll be providing Metro's definition of equity and Metro's Office of Equity and Race's definition. I'll give a primer on what I believe are best practices for equitable approaches to traffic safety and discussing about work that precedes my time at Metro. Just for context, I joined Metro this March. I'll also be talking about infusing equity into our practice and a few of the tools that Metro's Office of Equity and Race has developed for that. And lastly, Metro's forthcoming street safety policy. Next slide. So Metro's definition of equity, and I really thought it would be important to define equity to make sure we're on the same page of how we're all defining it, but also it's really clear of how I am defining equity as I recommend best practices. So Metro's definition of equity says that equity is both an outcome and a process to address racial, socioeconomic, and gender disparities to ensure fair and just access with respect to where one begins and the capacity to improve from that starting point to opportunities, including jobs, housing, education, mobility options, and healthier communities. Equity is achieved when one's outcomes in life are not predetermined in a statistical or experiential sense on their racial, economic, or social identities, and it requires community-informed and needs-based provision, implementation, and impact of services, programs, and policies that reduce and ultimately prevent disparities. Next slide. These following 5 points are what I recommend through my personal experience as a transportation safety planner, practitioner, and advocate. I've worked for nonprofits. I volunteered for nonprofits that do active transportation planning in Los Angeles. I've also worked in consulting and worked for LA Vision Zero and LA Metro and other cities and regions to promote traffic safety and, of course, equity. And so centering equity here really means centering historically marginalized and vulnerable communities or those most impacted by our planning processes. As I just said, at the Office of Equity and Race, we define it equity as that when the most vulnerable and marginalized have access to resources and opportunity without hindrance based on zip codes, race, class, and other markers of identity or other markers of oppression, quite frankly. Then the first one is centering communities most impacted by traffic violence. This is where our data analysis is really keen and really important, right? We need to identify what communities we're intending to bring into the planning process from the very beginning. I think data does a great job at uncovering that at a glance, but also knowing the local context will be really important. And I'll go a little bit more into depth in these in just a second. The second one is catering your engagement strategies to marginalized and vulnerable communities. Notice that I'm not saying have an open house and expect them to arrive. I'm saying have engagement events strictly devoted to those communities once you've identified them. Also ground truthing our collision data. Again, love collision data, love collision analyses, but sometimes we need to ground truth that data as well to make sure that some narratives that we haven't uncovered from community residents are also included as data. We also want to incorporate community feedback into those proposed improvements. There's no really significance in conducting community engagement if you're not going to figure out a way to actually incorporate it into your proposed roadway improvements. Of course, sometimes communities can say, I want a bridge, and you can't literally do engineering, build a bridge, absolutely. But for other aspects of feedback where it can be incorporated, that's absolutely something we should be doing. So transference from gaining that feedback to incorporating into the improvements, I think is really key here. And again, reflecting those changes to the community again. And lastly, go where there's the highest need, not the highest will. Next slide. In centering communities most impacted by traffic violence, as I said, you want to begin by identifying those populations disproportionately impacted by collisions in your project area. No surprise that in Los Angeles County, traffic crashes are the 4th leading cause of premature death, ahead of homicide, stroke, and lung cancer. But when we look at Black and Latinx communities, it is the 3rd leading cause of premature death. I absolutely know I'm preaching to the choir here that we know that many of our collisions, as Margot so brilliantly narrated, are often children, are often seniors, and are often low-income Black and brown folks in our city. Next slide. Once you have identified who those populations are, you should be, thank you so much, John, catering your engagement strategies to marginalized and vulnerable communities. What do I mean by that? I mean that you should be planning specific strategies and/or events or educational campaigns that focus on those communities. I don't mean this in so much as like target the victim. I mean it as you need to learn about their experiences. And if they're already historically marginalized and vulnerable, it can often be hard to get them at the table with traditional engagement strategies. What I've done in the past on previous Vision Zero projects is I've met an elotero who works the corridor in Avalon in South Central Los Angeles and had been doing so for 20 years. And what we ended up doing is we partnered with him. We paid him to give us raspados and elotes and work the events for us. And we gave away raspados and elotes to any and every community member that was willing to talk to us about, of course, street safety, but also their experience and take a survey. This was one of the most effective engagement strategies that we had throughout that project because, of course, everyone loves free food, but also the food is culturally relevant and representative of the corridor. He's been biking that corridor for 20 years. He knew it better than us and probably any engineers who are taking a look at that corridor. Depending on the population, you can cater events that focus on their lived experience and their culture in a respectful way. Of course, I don't mean have a Cinco de Mayo event or something because there's Latino populations, absolutely not. You also want to identify organizations that work with these populations in the project area. And I always recommend that you compensate all CBOs that you work with if that is a possibility, but conducting a walk audit with the base of residents that CBOs have, if they have one, or just with the CBO representatives to really understand community assets and community areas of congregation, if you're not familiar with them, are really great opportunities to get to know the corridor and also just to get to know a local CBO and establish local relationships. I think CBOs are key to pushing forward equitable engagement strategies, of course with traffic safety, but really in general. And of course, as Margot has mentioned, you can partner with local schools and develop strategies around youth, particularly, especially if they're the community or target that is being disproportionately impacted. In the past, I've also hired a street team with members of target communities in a project area, and that was effective for several reasons. One, if you see your neighbor on the street, you're more likely to speak to them about whatever it is, or just be curious as to what they're talking about. And there's already that instilled trust there with that community resident that maybe as community planners or practitioners, we don't always have if we're not familiar with an area. And also what that did was hiring a street team of members that didn't have a history of working around traffic safety really helped build street safety advocates that at the end of the process, those street team members were more passionate about Vision Zero than I felt I was because they'd really been in the weeds of the work, but they also had personal experience. Some of them had been hit by cars. A lot of them learned the personal stories of residents on those corridors and were emotionally invested in promoting safer streets because they saw the real life impacts that this was having on our communities. One more thing is that when we're weighing feedback from communities that we've conducted engagement in, weighing feedback from communities should be given higher consideration from the vulnerable and marginalized communities that you're targeting. Since they're more impacted when using the corridors, their perspectives and feedback should be weighed higher because they are already experiencing the disparate impacts of traffic violence. So that means that you will need to come up with a criteria with how you weigh community engagement comments. And that really is a strategy to uplift equity. If those communities have been historically left out of the conversation, how do we bring them in, but also how do we center them and make sure that we take that feedback seriously? Next slide. The next one is about ground truthing collision data. As I've mentioned, I think collision data is great and does a great job. I just don't want it to be interpreted as if I'm throwing collision data out the door. That's the very last thing I would ever recommend. But there are moments where collision data doesn't always have the full story because if you're talking about Black and Latinx and low-income communities or just communities that are over-policed in general, they may not always be willing to share if and when with the police they experience a collision. Of course, there could be other circumstances, but if a community is already over-policed, calling the police when you are involved in a traffic collision is not going to be the first step that you take. In previous street safety engagement that I've done in South LA, when I had a street team out there working on a corridor, when we were conducting engagement during a Friday night bike lights event where we gave out bike lights, those street team members witnessed a cyclist get hit by a car. When they supported that cyclist and asked the cyclist if they wanted to call the police and an ambulance to get support because he was visibly injured, the cyclist denied it because he said he was undocumented and didn't want to interface with ICE or risk interfacing with ICE because he sustained an injury and just didn't want to get blamed for having been involved in the collision. So there are situations where if we don't ask community residents where they've experienced near misses or collisions or where they feel the road is dangerous, we're not getting the full narrative, and our proposed improvements can miss the mark or not have the full picture. So when we're really trying to push forward on equity, qualitative data is just as important when understanding the lived experiences of safety on our corridor. And when we talk about asking community what streets feel unsafe, it's also important to listen to the other dynamics that come up. If there's an area that has gang issues or gang affiliation and we're proposing a bicycle facility through that corridor, some community residents may not be able to travel along that corridor. So are we really serving the full breadth of the community? Absolutely not. Another example that I've heard, particularly here at Metro within our AAN HPI groups, is that in response to some of the anti-Asian hate crimes that our riders have been experiencing, is that sometimes there's hesitancy to report violence to law enforcement that stems from their experience in their countries with oppressive or repressive police and military states in their homelands. So when we're thinking about traffic safety or when we're thinking about safety in general, the picture is a lot bigger than whether a collision has happened here or not. And we want to make sure that when we tailor our proposed street safety improvements, that they're thinking of those with solutions in mind. Next slide. And as I mentioned earlier, go where there is the highest need and not highest will. With the inception of the City of LA's Vision Zero program, many of us have heard with the recalls we had of Mike Bonin or the situations we had in Mar Vista or Playa del Rey, where safety improvements were rescinded because those residents had the resources to advocate and really litigate to get rid of those safety improvements. But in contrast, when I've conducted, and I think LA Vision Zero has conducted engagement in South LA, many times, not always, right? No community is a monolith. We hear community stories of like, oh yeah, you see that fire hydrant, a car ran into it last week. You're kind of late. We've been suffering with this for a while. Or finally, we've been waiting for improvements. Or even based off of my personal experience, when I've engaged residents in South Los Angeles around street safety, I've heard like, oh, look, you see my knee? I have metal in my knee because I've been hit by cars on this corridor multiple times. That's why I don't ride a bike anymore. So this also brings up the topic of when we're considering why communities don't bike or how we get communities on to these facilities, we also need to think about the bigger picture of why they may not be riding because they haven't had adequate infrastructure for decades. As I say, data can tell us where our roads are impacting the quality of life of our residents. I think that's the first step, but combine that collision data with qualitative data, and I think you have a bigger picture. It takes a little more effort, but I think it definitely gets us towards more roads that are equitable and serving residents, which is ultimately our goal. And you also want to prioritize safety improvements by the most dangerous roads. That is no surprise here. I think Margot and others have discussed it, so I won't stress that point. Next slide. Very briefly, I did want to discuss the array of tools that LA Metro's Office of Equity and Race has developed. They weren't developed for street safety, but they absolutely apply for traffic safety projects and a full array of projects that we conduct here at LA Metro. The first one I'll discuss is a rapid equity assessment tool, or the rapid equity tool. So this was developed during COVID for emergency decisions. People needed to make decisions quickly, and we needed a tool to be able to respond to the circumstances we were experiencing during COVID. The rapid equity assessment also allows you to apply an equity lens when you lack time or in a brainstorming or preliminary phase. And it's also helpful just for applying an equity lens quickly, which our staff were in that circumstance where they needed to do that. The second one is Metro's budget equity tool, or what people call MBEAT. The MBEAT applies an equity lens during the budget allocation process. And the goal here is a required consideration of benefits and burdens early on in the process. And we really hope that it helps us identify potential benefits and harmful impacts, particularly for marginalized communities, and how we can address them through our budget process early on. The next one is the Metro Equity Tool. This is still in the pilot phase, but we do have internally some projects that are using them, but it's not ready just for external circulation just yet. But this one provides a much more comprehensive look at your project for processes and outcomes, and this provides guidance to help ensure an equitable project development implementation process, and of course, equitable outcomes. It includes questions asking staff to review data, to engage with the community, to understand the disparities related to their project, but also the root causes of that disparity, and then to plan the project in a way that works to eliminate those disparities. Lastly is the Cbo Partnering Strategy, which just went public in June of this year. And the Cbo Partnering Strategy includes 7 recommendations of how Metro intends to partner with CBOs. One key one that I think is important for this discussion here is the CBO chartering process. So we're developing a chartering process that will take place between, of course, CBOs and LA Metro, or the consultants that we bring on board to bring on CBOs. And the chartering process identifies our mission, where our ways of being, where we align and where we don't. And it also discusses ways of moving forward when we do, experience conflict or maybe difficult discussions with CBOs. I don't expect every single CBO that Metro brings on board under contract to agree with the decisions and outcomes that Metro decides on, but I do expect those that we have under contract to bring those discussions with us and have those conversations to hopefully build trust and deepen our relationships over time. The CBO Partnering Strategy is really an opportunity to promote equitable and clear collaboration processes with CBOs and Metro. I am in charge of implementation of the Cbo Partnering Strategy here at LA Metro as well. Next slide. And lastly, very quickly, I do want to touch on Metro street safety policy. This is still very much so in development. Metro has been asked by the board to develop a regional street safety policy that includes creating a countywide data collection goal, with the goal of designing a program to document and analyze serious injuries and fatalities from transportation, but also to assess internal risk and liability to the safety of all of our provided public transportation services. That means we're also looking at how our riders get to and from the stations, and opportunities for improvements for how our drivers navigate our roads as well. Obviously, city staff are the ones that do the very hard work, as we just saw, of designing and implementation, but Metro's role can be more around, of course, assigning funding and policy and setting the tone for prioritizing improvements. Of course, we do not regulate local streets, as is common knowledge, but we can support safer streets within LA County through interfacing with local public right-of-way, especially through our BRT projects, our active transportation corridors, our first last mile projects, and of course our highway projects. With our funding priorities for local projects, as you know, we are a funder in the region, and with transportation operations, TDM, and of course public outreach and engagement. This policy is still in, and of course, of state and federal advocacy. Sorry, I almost forgot that one. It is still in the development phase, so we don't have much to share with the public, but we have gone to all of our, not all of them, but key existing advisory bodies at Metro, such as the Public Safety Advisory Committee, ADTN, and some of the service councils to present on our draft policy and ask for feedback. And we're really paying attention to how we can incorporate equity into this policy. I'm a part of the street safety policy team as well. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Caro. It's fantastic. Everything you've shared in your presentation with regard to, the considerations that you should have, right, when working with and in communities, and the experience that they have versus, some of us go in with data, right, points, but don't understand that qualitative experience fully, right? And this last piece, I'm thrilled to hear about, really excited to hear about the regional safety policy and your work on it. I know that having looked at some of the data, a lot of the transit riders in LA County are walking and biking to their stations, and they're and it's concerning, right, that they're experiencing a variety of issues as they try to use the services. And so relieved and elated, actually, to hear what you've shared today. We were going to ask where you thought traffic safety was going at Metro, but I think you already touched on that it's a work in progress. So we certainly hope that you'll keep us updated as you go forward about where that's headed, because we'd like to continue to highlight it for folks who want to see how you're meaningfully integrating equity into that work, that critical work. I do want to open it up for questions, because we only have a handful of minutes left with the group. I would offer you, Caro, as well as Rachel, Carl, as well as Margot, if you have questions for one another as panelists, or if anyone wants to post questions in the chat, this is really your opportunity to pose those direct questions to these folks who've shared their experiences working in their communities and the challenges really that they have encountered in doing the work. I don't know if anything has come through for you, John, or I don't see any hands raised yet. I do see one question that came through. How is the new Metro Public Safety Advisory Council's effort, how does that relate to public street safety?
So the PSAC will deal, and that's a great question in terms of the intersections of our work. PSAC is looking at safety on our system, right? And how members who are riders, I keep calling them members, and how riders are accessing our system. Of course, it has to do with policing, ticketing, and other topics that they're also considering. So when we're talking about public street safety, why we wanted their opinion particularly is because, as we may know, enforcement is often recommended as something to promote traffic safety and promote safer streets. So we wanted to get their feedback on what they thought of those policies, what through their personal experience, because many of them are, of course, public transit riders, but also pedestrians and bicyclists, through their personal experience, what feedback they had to share with us. So that's why we went to PSAC.
And I'm wondering, I have a question for you related to your presentation, something you referenced, how something that when we're conducting outreach, we need to consider is weighting community feedback. And I'm, haven't had that experience myself, but it's something that does come to mind, right? That those folks who do tend to show up, right, at our meetings, our workshops, or pop-ups, right? Sometimes their feedback, or who do respond to surveys, they have an outsized influence, I think, on shaping sometimes our plans and projects. And I wondered if you had any guidance or experience with what that could look like in terms of, again, weighting the community feedback that you do get.
Yeah, of course, what's going to be key here is making sure that you collect demographic data, whether through gathering public comments or through your surveys. It's very easy to do it via surveys. And I think, as I said in the beginning, you want to identify who those vulnerable populations are, and it goes two ways, right? Who's vulnerable through collisions, through the data, but also who just hasn't been historically engaged in our processes at this corridor. It's very, very context specific. And from there, I think you can develop a tier of, it's going to depend on the context, but obviously communities that are historically marginalized and vulnerable get more points in the rankings. And then communities or individuals who represent maybe middle class or like other more privileged demographics get lower points. Something that you should also do, and this is me assuming that you have your demographic data of this local community and you understand what the local demographics are, because you want to make sure that it's representative. And I think from there, it really depends on whether you'd like to do maybe a percentile ranking or I think the easiest is to do a points-based ranking. So maybe community comments from children who are Latino or just of color are ranked 3 points. Comments from communities from older adults who are also disproportionately impacted. This is assuming that children would be your most vulnerable population in this context. For adults who are vulnerable would be 2 points, and then 1 point would be just a person who is privileged in our society and has access to resources, et cetera.
Yeah, it sounds a bit like a Heinrich network methodology in some ways. I mean, that we rank the bikes, peds, older adults and children a little more heavily, and then the DAC intersection or the communities of concern intersection. I see that additional question that did come in for you. Thank you for sharing your expertise. How are the CBO partnerships informing Metro bike share system siting and promotion, and then the new Metro micro service? I don't know if that is something you would know how to respond to.
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean, if you have the background with the program, because Metro's huge.
Yeah, it is huge. I have not interfaced with Metro Bike Share, but I know that my colleagues, Keandra, Kyler Dodds, and Naomi are, so I'm sorry I don't have the direct answer for you. And I'm not sure if we've provided recommendations around the CBO partnering strategy with Metro Microservice, but I'm inclined to say we have not yet. That doesn't mean that it's not happening. The strategy just filled out the last week of June. So things are happening, but they're happening slowly. Next steps on the CBO partnering strategy is we launched a CBO training series that same week that our strategy launched on just very basic signing up to be a vendor with Metro, because the main way that CBOs are going to win work is through our procurement process. So we wanted to make sure that they were set up for success. We're also planning on the latter end to also train our staff on the CBO partnering strategy. But all of these things take a little bit of time because we're a team of 30 and this is my project. So it's just taking a little longer. So if they're not incorporating it at the moment, it doesn't mean that they're not considering it or thinking about it. I just think that there is a queue and also just a time that we need to train our staff up on the strategy as well.
You know, something I feel like that came up in your presentation about outreach and engagement, something that Rachel, I think, referenced to through UPlan is how much of a budget could be dedicated to outreach and engagement for a plan. I think, Rachel, was the figure you referenced about 60% of the budget?
Yeah, it was 63% to be exact.
Yeah. And I haven't heard of that level of, percentage, I guess, in a plan being dedicated to outreach and engagement, but it seems as though maybe you have, I don't know, Rachel or Caro, or if Carl or if Margot, maybe you can speak to this about what percentage of budgets for you are typically dedicated to outreach and engagement, and have you seen a rise in them because of really this pressing need and to engage more with folks? Is that something that's come up? I don't know, Rachel, you can speak to that. Any of the panelists?
Yeah, I would just say it's obviously becoming more and more prevalent. And I think the intent was not only to inform the plan, but also to, start building trust, not just between the particular staff working on the plan and the community in North Long Beach, but just through the city in general. When they see us at a community meeting, we're the city. And so just building those relationships, it was just a kind of a great opportunity to start that work.
Yeah, it sounds like it was like, I think you described capacity building. And I wondered maybe if you or Caro or anyone else wanted to address this, is how we sustain those partnerships with these groups that we work with, right? I've heard from different CBOs I've worked with in the past that the issue is we fund them only for a specific project, and then we leave and they're left holding the bag, so to speak, where people go to them and ask them questions and they feel like they should still be responsive. And it's just this ongoing issue. And I don't know how to, solve for that, or if you can, if any of you have any thoughts on that particular piece about how to sustain engagement with these partners.
This is Margot here. I'm sorry, I've been having some internet problems. So Courtney, I can see you. You can give me a thumbs up if you can hear me. Okay.
Yep.
But real briefly, one of the programs that we had, nope. Okay, I'll stop talking.
Okay, I think Margot's out for the count because of tech issues, but Caro and Rachel, or do you have thoughts on this particular piece about, you're talking about CBO partnering approaches and strategies and things, and how do we sustain, or how have you seen people sustain these relationships?
Yeah, absolutely. For Metro, at least with the CBO partnering strategy, it's going to look a little different because, well, for one, something that I forgot to acknowledge is that the development of the CBO partnering strategy had several touch points with CBOs where they were able to give feedback on the strategy. So this strategy has been completely developed in alignment and in partnership with CBOs who were able to give us feedback. On the other end, since we're launching our CBO training series, this means that we're about to have multiple touch points with CBOs. And I also see it as an opportunity to build relationships. I do have, I think, a general understanding of CBOs in the LA market area, but there's many more that we want to bring to the table that we don't have experience working with. And I think my role is really envisioned as deepening those relationships. When it comes to community engagement after a project is done, I believe that follow-up is crucial. We should follow up. So for example, on a previous project, I think we did community engagement in 2019, but those safety improvements didn't go in, I think it was sometime late middle or late last year, there should have been feedback through, and maybe there was, I'm not aware, I no longer was working on the project. There should have been feedback via email or just through quick canvassing on what the next steps are for the project. Like, sorry, actually by local, I actually don't know if it's a law for the city council or just a policy, but we need to repave the roads. So it's going to take a little longer. So little things like that, that let communities know that, yes, those community improvements are coming, but those roadway improvements are coming, but they're taking a little longer than anticipated, which is often part of the process. But I think being honest with those discussions is also important because it helps to build trust, and not so much as like, well, they did all of this engagement and they said they wanted to hear from us, but they disappeared. And so follow-up is important, even if the outcome is not the outcome you would like to be sharing. It's important to be honest with where projects are, because that's honestly how things work when we're putting in roadway improvements. It takes a little longer than anticipated.
Yeah, the sustained communications then with the communities to bridge, the difference, right? When you're not immediately bringing something. And I think Margot touched on that a bit about how, why the pop-ups and the demonstrations and other projects are helpful, because again, it takes a long time to do things, right, and implement things and meet the community needs. I think there's an additional question in the chat. John, did you want to introduce it? I know we have 2 minutes remaining. I want to respect everyone's time, but yeah.
Yeah, really quick question for, I think probably Carl, going back to the beginning of the presentation, you talked about the speed limits, reducing speed limits. And I know that's been an issue for a lot of cities in the region. Can you talk about how you're going about doing that and any challenges you're facing with, actually reducing speed limits on arterials, and maybe give us a 30-second version of it?
Yeah, one of the biggest challenges that we're facing is that in Long Beach, we have 9 council members. And during the course of our review, if we find that just by chance, we're not reducing or proposing to reduce any speed limits in a particular council district, that council member comes out and says, well, why not in my district? And it just so happens that during the course of the review, we don't find the change of conditions, or we don't find a particular reason that we can justify reducing the speed limit. So we really are just going through annually and looking at locations where we know we have a speeding problem, for example, or we know we may have a lot of complaints from residents. So we're taking notes and keeping track of where these hotspots are, and we pay particular attention to those hotspots when we do our reviews. And then we make sure that we are coordinating closely with PD, because again, those engineering and traffic surveys are really meant to support PD and their enforcement of the speed limit.
Which can be a whole other can of worms, I think, for us to talk about, I think.
Yes.
Because that's reimagining community safety probably discussion we'd want to, have again. I think, I know we hosted one within our traffic safety peer exchanges. People can tune in for the complications, right, for involving enforcement as a part of our safety approaches, right? That can be a significant issue for many of our communities that are most harmed. Well, on that note, which is not terribly positive, I know, but it's an ongoing work. I do want to extend our deep gratitude to our panelists today, Caro, Rachel, Carl, as well as Margot. Sorry for the tech issues that we did encounter today. Thank you for participating in what is our final traffic safety peer exchange this summer. As I mentioned at the outset, presentations will be mailed to all registered participants, and we'll be posting the recording online and emailing out when that is live as well. We do have a survey. I know John's linking to it in the chat. You'll be emailed it as well to let us know how this experience was for you. Because if we are able to offer these in the future, of course, we are interested in improving. And so we'd encourage you all to stay tuned for future updates from SCAG as well as the Go Human team. We're in the process of updating our traffic safety pledge, so be on the lookout for that in the next month or so. We'll be sharing it with you. And September is Pedestrian Safety Month. It's almost upon us. October is Walktober, and we look forward to sharing more information with all of you then and throughout the fall. So thank you again for joining us. Deepest gratitude to you, our panelists, our speakers today, for taking the time, and to all of you for joining us this afternoon. Thank you to Edward, our audiovisual support, and again, thank you all for being a part today.
Thank you. Have a good evening.